JavaScript and the DOM. The DOM stands for Document Object Model, and JavaScript sees the web document as an object, and it understands it from a hierarchical perspective. So the root object that JavaScript sees is the window itself. The window, our browser window, is the root object. And then that has three sub-objects: the document, the location of that document, and the history. We're really concerned with the document. And the document breaks down into an HTML tag. We've seen that certainly on our documents, on our web documents. And within the HTML tag, there's a body tag. And then we could have whatever HTML is making up the page. Here, I'm showing an article with a header and a paragraph and a footer, and that matches the HTML that's in the image here on the left. So if you look at the markup on the left, you can see how that matches the article here and in the diagram. And JavaScript sees the article as an object that has children. One child would be the header, and the header itself has a child, which would be the H1. And then another child of the article is a paragraph, and another child of the article is the footer, which also has a child, which is a paragraph. And we can see that represented in the diagram over here. These elements on the page are nodes, and JavaScript understands the relationships between the nodes. And we can use methods and properties to do what's called traversing the document and getting from one node to another so that we could affect it with JavaScript. So for example, if node A was that article and it has three children, you could say node A dot first child is node dash A1, and node A last child is node A3. And you can look through the descriptions on the left here and understand the relationships between these different elements. So node A1 dot parent node, for example, would be node A, or we can look at the children of node A as an array, and we could say node A child node square bracket 0 would be node A1, and so on and so forth, right down through this entire list. So we can actually use this relationship to work our way around an HTML document using JavaScript and be able to get elements and do things with them. Now, if you're coming to JavaScript from another language like C++ or Java or Python or something like that, this is a little weird. This is kind of strange. But really, when you think about it, JavaScript's tight integration in with the browser and with what happens on our document is really JavaScript's reason for being. And certainly we're seeing JavaScript now outside the browser and in other places, but JavaScript's main reason for being is the fact that it can do this stuff and other scripting languages can't, or other programming languages can't. And in 2009, when they decided that JavaScript was going to be the programming language for the web, it was going to be native to the browser, that's when this stuff really got solidified. And everybody wanted to follow the exact same specification. And even if they were doing slightly different implementations of it, they were following the specification so this would work with JavaScript in whichever browser you were in. And it's taken a while to get to compatibility across browsers with JavaScript, but we're pretty close to there these days. The dot syntax and methods. Notice we use dots or periods to separate objects from their properties or their methods in JavaScript. And on the right here, you can see that we have a number of methods that are related to being able to traverse the DOM or affect the DOM. insert before. We can create an element and insert it before another element. We can replace a child. We could say, take this child out of here, remove a child, append a child. We can add a new paragraph to the end of a div or something like that. Clone a node. We could take an entire div with all its contents and clone it and add it to the page somewhere else. We can create an element. We can create attributes. We can create a text node. These are all methods that JavaScript has built into it that allow us to do things to the document object model, to the document itself, and will affect the document there. One of the document methods you'll use most frequently, and is a good one to learn first, is getElementById. GetElementById is a document method or a function that belongs to the document object. Remember, that's how we define methods. And what we can use with getElementById is we can pass in a particular ID, and then we can do things to that element. That will go into our document, into our DOM, our document object model, and find that particular element and do something with it. So we could set the style property and the color subproperty to red, for example, for this paragraph that has an ID of 1. And remember, in HTML, when you have an ID, it must be unique. It must be a unique ID on the page. This is something I see as a mistake a lot of times with students learning to create web pages. They'll use an ID on the page multiple times. But the whole point of an ID is that it's unique. Just like you have a student ID or a driver's license ID or some other ID with a unique ID number on it, the whole purpose of having an ID is that it is unique. So let's give this a try. I'm going to come over to my code editor here, and you can see I've set up a page, and I guarantee you it's a good idea for you to do this as well. So I strongly suggest it, but I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say document. If I could type document.getElementById, and you can see as I start typing that it even comes right up here, and I can actually select it from the list to make sure I get it right, because you have to get the capitalization right. It's camel cased, so the get is lowercase, but E is uppercase, B is uppercase, and I is uppercase, but the D is lowercase. So you have to get that right, otherwise it won't work. And I'm going to pass in 1 because it's going to match this ID here. And I can set the style.color to red. If I save that, and then I come back over here, and you can see I have this web page loaded up here, and it's black here. But as soon as I refresh the page, you'll see that it's turned red. Now, I don't have any code in my HTML that's doing that. It's the script that's doing that after the fact. It's really important to understand this. So as I come down here, notice paragraph ID 1, and then style color red is added here. But I didn't add that. That's not in the HTML that I added. Over here in the HTML that I have the ID 1, but I don't have a style attribute on here at all. JavaScript took, when the page loaded, JavaScript loaded the paragraph the way I wrote it, and then what the script did is it went in and found that element with the ID of 1, and it added the style attribute here and set its color property to red. So JavaScript is doing that on the fly after the page has been retrieved. Right now, we're just loading it from our desktop, but you could be getting it off of a web server. You could be getting it from anywhere. And that page, when it gets to the browser, it gets rendered by the browser, and then the script runs down at the bottom of the page and affects the page after that paragraph has already been rendered. It happens so fast you don't even really see it. But this is a really great example of a document method, getElementById, which is allowing us to go into our document, find that ID, and then affect it on the page. Here's another document method that allows us to get elements on the page and do something with them. It's called get elements by tag name. And I have the S in elements highlighted because a common mistake is to leave it off because it's get element by ID, but this is get elements. So this is going to get more than one element. This is going to get a group of elements, a collection of elements. And then we can do something with that collection of elements. So let's give this a try. Here I have my page. I have some paragraphs on the page, and I can write a script here, document.get elements by tag name. And again, the best thing to do is to go down and make sure you select it from the list. That way you won't spell it wrong. But it's get elements with a capital E and an S by tag name. Make sure you get all the capitalization right there. And then I can actually pass in, say, a P for paragraphs. So what this is going to do is it's going to go in and get all of these elements. And I can assign that to a variable, var my paragraphs equals. So now my paragraphs is going to hold a collection of paragraphs. And if I console log that out, console.log my paragraphs. If I console log that out, let's see what I get. I'm going to come back over here to my page and refresh. And we don't see any difference here, but if I go to the console, you'll see I get an HTML collection of three things: paragraph, paragraph, and paragraph. And that's what's in here. And I can even fold this down and see what the different paragraphs are. It gives me some information about them. But it's giving me the collection of the paragraphs here. So that's kind of important to understand about this particular method. Whereas get element by ID gives me always just one thing. It'll always give me one because IDs are unique. Whereas get elements by tag name will give me an HTML collection of elements that I need to then do something else with. If I wanted to set the color of these paragraphs to red, then I would need to use a loop because I can't apply the style color to a collection of things all at once. I have to apply them to each item in that collection. So I need to use a loop to loop through each of the elements in that collection. So I'm going to use a for loop here. And let's go ahead and do this over here, rather than console log this out. I'm going to use a shorter variable here. My paragraphs is kind of long. I'm guaranteed to type that wrong at some point. So I'm just going to call it P's, something like that. That's fine for paragraphs. That's fine. All right, great. So I'm going to make a for loop. And again, remember, if you've been doing the challenges and really getting used to the syntax, you should be able to just write a for loop. For var I equals, not one, I equals 0, while I is less than P's dot length I plus plus. And then we've got our curly braces. And in here, I'm going to take each paragraph. So I'm going to say P's square bracket I dot style dot color equals red. Now, if I just do this, you'll see it'll work. It'll actually go through this entire loop. The first time through the loop, this thing has 3 paragraphs in it. It's going to get paragraph 0, and set its style color to red. And then I gets incremented from 0 to 1. 1 is less than 3, so it will get paragraph 1, which is this one here, and set its color to red. I gets incremented again to 2. 2 is less than 3, so it'll come in, it'll get paragraph 2, that's this one here, and set its color to red. And then I gets incremented to 3. 3 is no longer less than 3, because remember ps.length, the length of this is 3. So 3 is no longer less than 3, and the script will end. So let's give that a try. Let's run that over here. If I refresh this, you can see all my paragraphs turn red. Now, the loop goes so fast, you can't even see it. So let's do something to make it so we can really see that this is actually a loop. So I think this is kind of interesting. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add alert. I'm going to use my my backticks here. Showing paragraph I, and then don't forget, since that's going to be a variable, we're going to do $, curly brace, curly brace. Now, if I run this in Chrome, I'm going to get this alert 3 times. Showing paragraph 0, showing paragraph 1, showing paragraph 2, and then it turns the colors. Even better is to show this in Firefox. So I'm going to switch to Firefox web browser over here. Firefox does things a little bit differently. It uses the Mozilla rendering engine, and so it renders things a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and open our page here in Firefox. And there's my DOM HTML. And notice the difference here. This one actually shows the first paragraph turns red, and then I get the alert. And then we see the second paragraph turn red, and I get the alert. And then I get the third paragraph turning red. So you can actually see the loop actually running. And usually these loops run so fast you don't even see them. But with the alert in there, you can actually see that that loop is running and turning the paragraphs red one at a time in the collection. And I think that that's helpful in understanding how JavaScript works with collections of elements. The next document method that we're going to look at is getElementsByClassName. And this method will do exactly what you think it will do. It will allow us to go into our document and get elements that have a particular class name and put them into an HTML collection. So that's very useful as well. Let's give it a try real quick. Here you can see I've added class equals special, and on my image over there it was blue, but whatever class you want to put is fine. It doesn't really matter as long as you set up a variable, var my class equals document dot get elements by class name, this one here. And again, make sure you get all the capitalization right or it won't work. And we're going to get special. Make sure you spell it the same as it is there. I'm likely to spell that wrong. So that will take all of these elements, in this case it's just 2, and stick them into a collection. And then the same as before, we're going to need to use our loop to go through and change these items. For var I equals 0, while I is less than my class dot length. I could just put a 2 there, but it's better to use this just to make sure that I get all of them, no matter how many there are. I plus plus. And then I could do my class square bracket I. First time through the loop, that's going to be a 0. Second time through the loop, it's going to be a 1, and then it'll finish. Dot style dot color equals red. And that should work just fine. Let's go test it out. And it turned those two classes red. Now, one more point of interest while we're here. Even if I just had one element on the page that had this class, I could give it an ID and use getElementById. But if I am going to use getElementsByClassName, even if there's only one, it still is going to return a collection of elements. And that collection is only going to have one element in it. And I still need to use a loop or some other way of getting to the element inside that collection, even though there's only one. And you'll see the loop will still work. It'll just run only one time. A little bit easier way of doing that is I don't really need a loop here because I know that there's only one element in this collection. So I know it's going to be element 0. So I don't need a loop. I can just make this 0 and get rid of the loop. Like so. Kind of clean that up a little bit. So now I've got my class is getting elements by class name special, and my class 0. Since I know there's only one, it's going to be my class 0. It's going to be that one in the collection. So I can access it through, because it's treated like an array there. It's not actually an array. It's a collection of HTML elements, but I can treat it like an array to go and get element 0 out of there. And you'll see that will work just as well. But the important thing here to understand is that if you're using getElementsByClassName or getElementsByTagName or anything else that gives you a collection of elements, you have to go in and treat it as if it's a collection, because that's what it is, and not just as an individual element. And that's easy to forget, especially if you have only one. You're like, how come I can't just change that one? Why can't I just use my class style color red? Because there's only one element with that class in there. But JavaScript is getting a collection of elements, even if the collection only has one element, or even if it has 0 elements in it, it'll still be a collection of elements. So that's an important thing to understand about getElementsByClassName and getElementsByTagName. The next document method that we're going to look at is query selector. Now, the history here is a little bit interesting because in 2009, as we said before, ES5 became the de facto standard for scripting for the web. But there was the rise of a library called jQuery that became extremely popular, and it remains very popular to this day. Less so now than it was, but it's still a very popular library that made getting elements in the DOM and doing things with them a lot easier. And jQuery was very popular for that reason. And due to that popularity, JavaScript had added to it in 2013, so before ES6, an API that allows us to use query selector and query selector all, which we'll also look at, to get elements from the DOM. And it's a little bit more convenient, but it works a little bit differently than the older getElementById, getElementByTagName, getElementByClassName methods. So these are newer methods and they're very useful, but they work a little bit differently. And because of the introduction of these methods, jQuery is not nearly as necessary as it used to be. And we'll still learn jQuery. We'll be learning that in the second course in the specialization. But now we can actually get elements in our DOM a little bit easier than we could just with the older methods. Okay, so let's take a look at query selector and the way that works. So over here, I have a document and I have a div with an ID on it. And then inside there, I've got a paragraph of the class. Well, I could do something like this. Var my text equals document dot query selector and then what I would pass in is actually instead of just some class, I would put either I could put some class. You use so it's different here is before we didn't use the CSS syntax. Now we have to use the CSS syntax with query selector. Or I could even be more specific and I could say, go find #special dot some class to get to some class inside the ID special. And what's nice about this is that query selector will always return the first element that it finds that matches what you pass in here. So even if I had another paragraph with some class on it, this will always only return one thing to my text. Let's put a semicolon there and see if this works. My text dot color, style dot color equals red. And if I go over and test this document, and again, I recommend that you give this a try yourself, you can see that it's turned that paragraph red. Now, if I were to go in here and add my class, some class, to another element on here, like this one here, you'll see it will still only affect the first paragraph if I go back and refresh this, because it only gets the first element that it matches. And that's very useful for when you want to go in and get something like that. And again, remember with both query selector and query selector all that you have to pass in, when you pass stuff in, you're passing in the CSS syntax, #special instead of just special, or dot some class instead of just some class. That's really important with query selector. Okay, great. Let's take a look at the query selector all method in the next video. The query selector all method does what you would think it would do, is that it allows you to grab a group of elements again, but this time using the newer, more updated DOM API query selector all. So let's go and give that a try really quickly here. So over here, I've got my div ID special and I've got some paragraphs in here. And I can do something like var my text equals document dot query selector all. I want that one, query selector all. And I could pass in here in quotes, I could pass in #special P. And that's going to get me all of the paragraphs that are inside this div special. So I can go into my document and find a particular group of elements somewhere in my document. But again, with this, we're going to need a for loop. For var I equals 0, while I is less than my text dot length I plus plus. And then I can do my text square bracket I dot style dot color equals red. There we go. Save that, and then we should be able to test it over here and see when I refresh the page, it is turning all those paragraphs red. And just one more time to just drive this home. Notice in here when I go look in that div, it's added style color red to each one of these paragraphs. That's what it's doing. It's going into special and finding the paragraphs and affecting the DOM after the page, after the HTML initially loaded. It's really important to understand that that's the way this works. So query selector all will allow us to get groups of elements, and then we would loop through them to affect them one at a time. So far, we've talked about 5 document methods. 3 of them are older. Document get element by ID, we'll still use that quite a lot. Document get elements by tag name, and document get elements by class name. You might use those less often now because now we have the newer methods, query selector and query selector all. But these are just some of the document elements that allow us to add elements to the page. Next, I want to talk about working with properties. And we've already seen this a little bit. We've seen element.style.color. So we're going in and we're getting that element, whatever the element is, we've got that element, whether it's paragraphs or whether it's a div or whatever it is, we're getting that element with our document methods. We're getting those elements, and then we can apply the style property. We can get the style property and the color subproperty and set it to whatever color name we want. And there are other properties that we can use. There are a number of them. Some of the more popular ones or ones that we'll use more frequently are inner HTML. We'll be seeing that one quite a bit. And class name is really useful so that you can actually take an element and apply a class to it. This is super useful in modern JavaScript because CSS has become so powerful. Now we can put animations in CSS, and then when we want to animate something, we can use JavaScript to add that class in CSS that has the animation, and the animation will take place in the screen. And that's a really, really great way to create interactive or animated elements on a web page. So we have the document methods, and now we have element properties that allow us to work with the properties of certain elements, but there are also element methods or element functions. And those are also really useful. So for example, set attribute, we could pass in an attribute name and then set its value. So not only can we, back here we could set the class name by using the class name property. Here we could set the class name by passing in class and then passing in a value. I forgot a quote at the end there. But we could pass in the value there, or we could do something else. We could use on an anchor tag, we could set the href attribute and set its value. Or we could remove an attribute, or we could get an attribute and do things with it. Notice that methods are distinguished by the fact that they have parentheses. So when you're using a method or a function, it has parentheses, whereas the properties don't have parentheses. They have an equal sign and then the value. So that's how you can tell the difference between a property and a method. Okay, great. Let's see what else we can do with this. This may be a little bit confusing at the moment, but I promise that as we practice this stuff, it'll start to make more sense. But it does take a little bit of getting used to all these methods and properties for working with our document to affect our web pages. Next, we'll take a look at one of the element properties that we just talked about in the previous video and see how powerful it is. And that's inner HTML. And if you look at this image here, you can see I have a div with an ID special, and I can use any of my document methods to go in and get that div. And then I could use inner HTML to actually change the contents in that div. I can replace these contents with something else entirely, completely new, completely different, and that something else could have HTML in it. So let's see what that looks like. So over here, I have my div ID special, and I have these 3 paragraphs in here. But down here, I could say var my div equals document dot get element by ID. Pick it from the list so you don't spell it wrong. Special. With this version, we're not using the pound here. We're using the older get element by ID. We can switch that in a minute just so you see what that looks like. But then I can say, okay, I've got that element, my div dot inner HTML equals, this is an element property, so we use the equal sign, and then inside quotes, I can create a completely new piece of content to stick in there. There we go, that's my P there. Okay, great. So now when I run this, you'll see over here, it's still red from before, but that's okay. Those paragraphs are going to get removed and replaced with a new paragraph. Look at that. And if I come down here and look and inspect in my body and look at div ID special, there's only 1 paragraph in here in my inspector. Whereas if I were to do view page source, you'd see 3 paragraphs in there, because when the page loaded, it had 3 paragraphs. And then the script ran and it removed those 3 paragraphs and put this one in instead. And that's what JavaScript is doing. And I can't express how powerful this is, because frequently what we need to do on our web pages is take a bunch of content and replace it with some other content. Now, here I'm using get element by ID special. I could also do query selector. But if I use this one, then I would pass in pound special. You see the difference there. This is the newer method, and it uses the CSS syntax to get to that element. But this will work just the same. If I go back and refresh this page, you'll see it'll do exactly the same thing. It'll get my new paragraph and put it in there. So you could use whichever document method you want. Once you get that element, then you can use your element properties to affect the element here. Now I'm putting this all inside of this div here, but I don't need to use the variable. I could just do document get element by ID special and then put this here. It just makes for a very long line. So it's kind of helpful, and that'll work. It's kind of helpful to have the variable, but you don't have to have it. I could just go document query selector special dot inner HTML and then set my property right there, and that'll work just as well. There's my new paragraph. So that's using the inner HTML. And again, I just cannot overemphasize how powerful inner HTML is. We could use this in lots and lots of places to get elements on our page and then replace those elements with completely new elements. And you can put more HTML in there. We could put an entire document of HTML inside this div. Not just one paragraph, but you could put articles, you could put all kinds of stuff, images, all kinds of things could go in there using inner HTML. The next element property that I want to show you, which is extremely useful, is the class name element property. So let's take a look at how this one works. Here I have a div with some paragraphs in here, and I'm using my query selector to get the first paragraph. Because remember, instead of returning a collection, query selector returns the first one that it finds. So it's going to go in here and look for the first paragraph. And then I'm going to take that first paragraph and I'm going to use the class name property, element property, to set the class to blue. And up here I've added style and I've added a class blue here to my document. So let's see how this works. I'm going to go over to my page over here, and you can see I've added up here a rule here to set for anything that has the class blue here. So let's come down here. I'm going to call this var first para equals document dot query selector. And remember, we have to use the CSS syntax. In this case, it's just a P because it's just a tag selector. But I'm going to go get that first paragraph. Now I've got 3 paragraphs, but remember, query selector just returns the first one. And then I'm going to say, okay, first para. Set the class name. And you can see here, there's one called class list. I'm just showing you a few of the document the document properties that are super useful, but there are plenty of other ones that you can look up and work with as well. Class name equals blue. So now when I run this, come back here, click on my document here, I've got my 3 paragraphs, but when I refresh the page, it turns the first paragraph blue. And if I come down here and look at this, what has it actually done there? But it's added class equals blue onto that paragraph. Sure, I could have set the style color property to blue, but adding the class blue is even more powerful because even though in both cases I'm just setting the color, I could have a lot more declarations in this class up here that would do all kinds of things. That I could be adding an animation. I could be doing all kinds of really cool stuff. And we'll get to do some of those things in this course. So, so hold on to your hat because it's coming. But first, I just want to introduce the basic concepts to begin with. And this is a super useful one, using the class name property to set a class that already exists on the page. It's just really, really powerful. Back to our slides here. We've looked at a few of the element properties that we can set. The style property with its subproperties for our different CSS features. We can use that one. We can use the inner HTML property. That's extremely powerful for replacing HTML inside of any element. And then there is the class name property that allows us to put a class name on things. The next thing I want to look at really quickly is some of the element methods. Remember, these are properties because they've got the equal sign and then a value, but we also have element methods. And the first one we'll look at is set attribute. So here I have a form, and let's just do this one really quickly here. I have a form, and I'm going to say var my checkbox equals document dot get element, or I can do query selector. Query selector input, and then I'll get my first input field here. And then I could do, okay, my checkbox dot set attribute, and set attribute takes 2 parameters. I'm going to say, what is the attribute that I want to set? In this case, it's checked. And I'm going to set the value, which is also checked. Checked, checked. And that's the way. What that will do is it'll come in here and it's going to set a checked attribute and set it to checked, which will make the checkbox checked by default. So if we go over and view the page, currently without having set that checkbox, you can see I've got a checkbox here, but it's not checked. When I refresh the page, it comes up as checked by default. And if I come down here and look at this, you can see checked equals checked. It's added that attribute into the page, into my HTML here. So set attribute could be used for any number of attributes. You want to set a an image source on an element, you could use this. You want to change the href on a link, you could use this. Any attribute could be accessed with set attribute, and you could set it to whatever value you want to set it to. And that is another very powerful tool that allows us to change content on our web pages. I have shown you a few of the document methods, the element methods, and the element properties in this lesson. And there are lots more. There are many, many more that you can use to do all kinds of interesting things to your pages. But I think it's helpful to see just a few to begin with, to see how those work and to experiment with those in a limited way, and then add more features and methods and all of that stuff as you go along. I do want to show you just a few more in this lesson, just because I think it's helpful to just see that there are different ways of doing things in JavaScript. And this one I want to show you is a way of creating elements and text nodes in JavaScript and then adding them to the page. It's kind of an interesting process. And again, we've used inner HTML, and we can use that to also change content on the page, but this is just a different way of doing it. So here, let's actually switch over to the code editor so that we can actually do this. Here, I'm going to make a variable var my tag, and I'm going to say document dot create element, create an element. And what am I going to create? I'm going to create a paragraph. So this makes a new paragraph and puts it into my tag. Create element is a document property that makes a new element. And then I'm going to make a new text node, var my text equals document dot create text node here's a new paragraph. So I'm going to make the text node. So JavaScript creates a text node. We create the paragraph. We create the text node. And then we're going to say my tag dot append child my text. So that takes the paragraph that we just created, the text node, this text, and sticks it into the paragraph tag that we've created. So all of this is just happening in memory in JavaScript. And then we have to actually put it on the page. So I'm going to get my div here, var my div. My div equals document dot query selector div. That's going to go find the first div on the page. And then I can say my div dot append child my tag. So we're doing a multi-step process here where we're taking the paragraph, we're creating a paragraph, we're creating some text, putting the text in the paragraph, and then going and getting our div and putting the paragraph, appending it to the end of the paragraph there. Let's see if I did this right. If I come back and do this over here and refresh, you can see that my first paragraph is here and a new paragraph has been appended inside the div. It's been added to the div here. And JavaScript is doing that through this process. Could I have just used inner HTML and added and changed the contents of this div so that it had these two paragraphs? Sure, I could have done it that way. But sometimes it's useful this seems like a kind of convoluted, complicated way, but sometimes it's useful to actually create the elements using the document method create element to create content to stick in those elements and then to append them to the page in particular places. Sometimes that's useful, and sometimes a better way to go than using inner HTML in certain circumstances. One last method that I want to show you in this lesson is how to remove an element from another element. And again, we could use inner HTML and just replace all the contents all at once, but sometimes removing elements is useful. So let's take a look at this example really quickly. Here I have a div with 2 paragraphs in it, and I'm going to go ahead and get that div and put it into a variable, var my div, and assign it document dot query selector div. So that'll go get the first div on the page, which there's only one, so that's nice and easy. And then I could do my div dot remove child, that method. And which child am I going to remove? Well, I'm going to say my div dot children square bracket 1. So what that's going to do is it's going to go into my div, look at its children, and find child number 1. Remember, this is child number 0 here. That's 0, this is 1. So that will actually go and remove this second paragraph from this div. Put a semicolon there, save that, and then let's go over to our browser here. And you can see I've got the 2 paragraphs there. When I refresh the page, that second one is gone. And down here, you'll see it's not in here anymore. It's been taken out. JavaScript removed it. So removing elements using the remove child method is a really useful tool for removing elements from the page if you need to do that. And so here we've seen a lot of different methods that we can use on our web pages to do all kinds of things. And we've talked about some of the document methods, some of the element methods, and some of the element properties that we can use to go in and affect content on our page. And remember, JavaScript sees the page as this tree of objects, starting with the window and building down from there. And we can traverse that document and find elements on there and then affect them using these different methods and properties. And that's how we're going to create all kinds of interactive elements on our web pages.